We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. In the face of massive tariffs, stock market chaos reigns. Donald Trump imposed 125% tariffs on China one day, and then announced that Apple iPhones and computers are exempted. Well, the next day he announced that the exemption isn't really an exemption. Maybe it's a pause. Much is uncertain, but one thing is certain. The U.S. confrontation with China has entered a new and dangerous stage. Professor Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Brian. Glad to be here.
Well, there's a lot to talk about again, as we talk every week, but each day, each hour brings new stories. I'm looking at the Financial Times, Richard, very important British financial newspaper, maybe the premier financial newspaper, at least in Western countries. Here it is. The U.S. and China are locked in a dangerous trade standoff, with the world's two largest economies trading tit-for-tat blows as Donald Trump demands Beijing seek a deal from his administration. China relies on the U.S. as an almost irreplaceable market for its manufactured goods, but experts warn that Washington should not underestimate Beijing's capacity to resist Donald Trump's coercive tactics. The combination of centralized political control, an increasingly diversified export market, and its virtual stranglehold on some strategically vital minerals, including rare earth metals, gives Beijing plenty of negotiating power. The question is how far it can use its leverage without suffering even more damage itself. Richard, there's been a developing consensus of hostility towards China for the last 15 years. Now it's a given. The Democrats, the Republicans, they have different variables about how to implement the animus and hostility towards China. But there's very rarely a voice that speaks up and says, well, hey, actually, the United States should be cooperating with China rather than in a confrontational mode with China. Donald Trump has taken it to a whole new level. And you can see by the response of the government in China that they're not intending to appease the Trump administration. They just announced, by the way, earlier this morning, that China would put a pause on any more plane orders from the Boeing company. Anyway, we've talked about it before, but each week brings new news. I want to get your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about it a lot for the same reasons everybody else has, because you can hardly get away from it with each day's news. Mr. Trump may not be all that much of a strategist and not that much of a business person, but he has mastered an ability to keep himself in the news. It used to be limited to the United States. Now he has the whole world. He's on the front page nearly everywhere. The tariffs put him there because he is now literally threatening everybody. And so he gets his picture on the front page because people are struck and worried. And before I even take a step further, let me talk about that for a moment. We've not seen this before. China, to take one example, hasn't done anything remotely like this. The Financial Times may enjoy listing, they have a command economy or a dictatorship, the usual Western noise about the East. But in point of fact, when it comes to dictating to the rest of the world, China it takes a back seat to what this government in the United States has just done. Let me remind everyone, no conversation, no discussion, no debate. Unilaterally, the government of the United States informs virtually every other country on earth that they will now have economic difficulties because of what the United States government wants. That's a dictatorial pronouncement, folks. That's not a democratically arrived at anything. Remember what democracy is. If you're affected by a decision, you have the right to participate in it. There was no participation in all the 180 countries of the world. Mr. Trump didn't bother to give them any participation. Now, he says, after he takes the action, he may negotiate with them as to how much they must give him to it. Wow. You know, when two guys in trench coats come into the neighborhood dry cleaning store and announce to the patron of the dry cleaning store, we're here to pick up our $200 a week of protection money. And the naive patron turns to them and says, what do I need protection from? Who do I need protection from? And they smile at him and they say, from us. That's what this is. This is a racket. And the whole world knows it. Only the American people live in a bit of a fog about what they're doing. But the impact of this, let me warn you all, on behalf of the rest of the world. Every government in the world, everyone, has economic problems of one kind or another, including us. But what every government in the world will now be able to do is blame the United States for their problems. And there'll always be a grain of truth, because whatever problems they had, Mr. Trump just made them worse. So this whole notion that this is some strategic masterstroke, you must be kidding. This is not a masterstroke. This is a colossal blunder. Okay. Now to respond to your immediate question. The Financial Times makes a mistake, which itself it corrects. It refers to the dependence of China on the export market to the United States. I forget the exact word you used, but crucial or very important. And then when it lists the three reasons why China is not such tough shape, one of them turns out to be its diverse export market. Well, let me translate that into real simple English. The Chinese decided 10 years ago that their economic development, spectacular as it was and is, was lopsided in a way they had to deal with. It was too dependent on exports rather than producing for their own country's market, and it was too dependent within the dependence on exports on those to the United States. So in fact, the United States absorbs a perfectly manageable portion of their exports. They don't have to worry, which is part of the reason, that they're not worried. Yes, they have the rare earths, and I'll come back to that. And yes, they have, but they don't have to worry about that, not only because the portion of their exports that the United States takes is not that big anymore, because they've been working to reduce it. But here's the other thing, and then I'll stop. The Chinese have worked super hard over the last 10 years, not only to reduce their dependence on exports and exports to the U.S., but to build up really strong economic alliances with other countries, and other countries that together amount to 60% of the world's population. If you add up all the BRICS countries today, all the people, all the countries that have chosen to become members or partners of BRICS, It's over half the population of this planet. That's the market that China will now pivot to. The American part will shrink away, and they will service 50 to 60% of the world's people. And you know what? The anger in the world, in country after country, for what Mr. Trump is putting them through now, will make them 5 times more eager to cut a deal with the Chinese when they come knocking than they would have been before Mr. Trump. No. Master deal maker? No. How about the name Klutz?
Xi Jinping went to Vietnam in the last few days, Richard. And Vietnam had become very close to the United States. It signed a strategic partnership agreement with the United States. Obviously, the United States was trying to pick out other countries in Asia to nurture a relationship with, so as to compete with China. The Trump administration, the first Trump administration, vetoed Scotch, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Obama had been sort of developing. That was a way to, quote, write the rules of the road, as Obama said, without China writing them, having the U.S. write the rules of the road for trade in Asia, and trade in the Pacific constitutes 50% of world trade. Trump came in and ripped that up. He ripped up the nuclear arms agreement, where Obama made a tentative early normalization effort with Iran, I think partly to stop the U.S. being bogged down in endless losing conflicts in the Middle East in order to pivot to Asia to confront China or to compete with China. Anyway, my point is that here we are, the Vietnam signed this sort of strategic partnership with the U.S., and the U.S. was nurturing the relationship to be an anti-China relationship. And then Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Vietnam, and Xi Jinping goes to Hanoi, meets with the leader of the Vietnam, also a country ruled by a communist party. Then Xi is going to Brazil. He's taking 1,000 Chinese businessmen with him in order to meet with Lula. And again, Brazil is the biggest country in Latin America. Trump can do all he wants about Panama, about reclaiming Panama. By the way, the Chinese government's not allowing the Chinese company that sort of manages the canal. It's a Hong Kong company. They're not letting them bow to Trump. He can talk about Greenland, but when you think about Asia, the dynamism of Asia, the dynamism of Latin America, of Brazil, for instance, the U.S. is shooting itself in the foot. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to flesh it out a little bit about this rare earths business. The United States is dependent on a whole lot of raw materials that are scattered around the world, but happen not to be located below the soil of the United States. And therefore, and this has always been true, the United States, like every other country, has key dependencies on materials that are either located abroad or processed abroad so that they can be brought to the United States. And China, being a large country as countries go, has a lot of them. If you look at the BRICS and look at the closest ally China has, which is Russia, let's all remember, Russia is the largest country by geography on this planet. So you're talking between the enormity of Russia and the largeness of China, a massive part of the world that the United States has now alienated in ways that will take a long time to fix. But the United States isn't passive. It isn't one day discovered rare earths, and it didn't one day discover that the Chinese are where they're buying them from. They knew that. Now here's something which the Guardian, the British paper The Guardian, on the morning of April 15th, 2025, has a wonderful story about how the leaders of high-tech in the United States. And many of the largest donors to Mr. Trump's campaign are also major shareholders in a half dozen companies that are doing mining in Greenland, it turns out. And that Greenland may be the locus for lots of the electricity generating that the high-tech industry needs to operate the AI and all the rest of it. In other words, they've been busy. One of the reasons is Greenland is thought to possess likely quantities of the rare earths, among other things, which those mining companies are busily searching for using the money that Mr. Trump's donors gave them. I mean, this stinks to high hell. That's what it does. Anyone who knows about classic governmental grift should have their antenna vibrating about all of this. But mostly these are excuses. The issue with China is not about rare earths or even export-import. The imports from China, let's remember, half of them come from subsidiaries of American corporations who went there precisely because it was more profitable to produce in China and ship it back here than it was to produce it here in the first place. Mr. Trump yells at the Chinese, but the Chinese didn't make the key decision. The Chinese didn't decide for those companies to move. Those companies, led by good old Americans, made that decision. And they made it for the good old capitalist reason to maximize their profits. That's the reality. And the reason they're not coming back to the United States is the same as the reason why they left, and tells you more about Mr. Trump's lousy planning. The wages here are too high. They're not coming here. It's not competitive. Everywhere else in the world, or almost everywhere, the wages are lower. And that's where they're going. And when you add that the market is growing faster outside the United States than inside, well, then you have the 1-2 punch of all capitalism. Entrepreneurs go where the wages are low and the market is growing. The United States is not that place, and tariffs aren't going to make it that place. It looks good. You can talk a big line. You can stand up there and tell you, as our president did, that a lot of countries are coming to kiss a part of his anatomy. But the reality is, this isn't going real well. Not only is he making enemies out of the world by this approach, look what he's doing to Harvard by trying basically the same thing. Instead of tariffs, of course, you can't do that to Harvard, they're inside. So what do? You decide to be really concerned about anti-Semitism. That's as genuine as a $4 bill. That's the excuse to play a game. I'm going to hit you with monetary difficulty, just like a tariff does, unless you do what I want you to do, which is to be more conservative like me and to help me with my politics and not be in your own mind, whatever that is. Columbia folded. Princeton folded. Harvard, to my surprise, didn't. Well, that's a sign, folks. By the way, for transparency, I went to Harvard. I'm a graduate of Harvard. I enjoy it. When I arrived at Harvard, one of the people I had hoped to study with was a man named Paul Sweezy. but Harvard fired him because of the McCarthy days back then, and he was a Marxist, and oh boy, Harvard couldn't have that. So Harvard has a very mixed record. But this time, Alan Garber, the president, all of us alumni got a message a little bit in advance of the press about all of this. Okay. For me, it's a sign, like we're going to see around the world. The Chinese stood up and said, no, 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 no. And now the head of Harvard stood up and said, no, 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 no. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Is all the mistake, is all the posturing, is all the fakery about to come back and really be a problem? For the moment, it looks like it.
I'm glad you mentioned Harvard. I, too, was very heartened by the fact that they stood up. Of course, they have a very big endowment, a $15 billion endowment, which gives them some comfort that others don't have. But the other schools, Columbia also has a big endowment. Capitulating to a witch hunt is contagious. You don't want to be a witch yourself, so you go along and you capitulate. So these big centers of American capitalist power and prestige, one after another, folding before Donald Trump. I mean, really shameless. So it's very good. And I agree with you that maybe bravery is contagious too. And whether Harvard has a big endowment or whatever the reason is, the fact that they stood up, I think will encourage others who want to stand up. So I think it's extremely important. There's another element of... Go ahead, Richard.
Add one point to it. Look, as I've tried to make clear, the American university, from the time I went to these schools, has changed. When I went, it was still largely an educational institution. I went to Harvard, I went to Stanford, and I went to Yale. I'm a poster boy for elite education in this country. And those were mostly educational institutions. Over the last 40, 50 years, they have changed. They have become mega corporations. Yale, where I spent much of my time, is now the owner-operator of a dozen or more hospitals. It's as much a medical corporation as it is an educational corporation. And the same is true for most of the other large, well-known schools. But part of that was a deal that was made between the university and the government. The government needs lots of advice and counsel. It needs people to do in-depth studies. And so they decided the way to do that, rather than try to set up their own institution to do research, was to take advantage of the fact we already got some, called universities and colleges. And they gave them a ton of money. And the universities and colleges were happy because they were jacking up the prices for their students so badly that the students, as we now know, have to go into lifelong debt to get the BA degree. And this could be softened, at least a little, with government money. I won't bore you with it, but I have been present as a faculty member in enough universities to know if you're good at bringing in grants from the government, your career prospects are significantly better than if you're not good at that. And it goes from the Defense Department, which dishes out huge parts of this money, to virtually every other part of the government, which does likewise. And the government of this country, for better or worse, benefited. Many of the things it did, technologically, diplomatically, and you name it, were projects in which university research played a very important role. And for the universities, all that money from the government, now, did it have bad results? You bet. The university and the government became much too close. Mr. Trump doesn't want them to be Democrats. He wants them to be Republicans. The Democrats had up until recently won that game. Most faculty are Democrats, not Republicans, at least everywhere I've been. Maybe parts of the country are different, but where I've been, yes, it's true. It's not so. But the government that built the universities was run by Republicans and Democrats. This is an outlying Republican effort to try to break. And that's a very important thing. And the irony is, it weakens the United States. It weakens the bond between the university and the government. They become more and more adversaries. Lots of bitterness left here from these kinds of struggles. That's not going to make the place work better. That's not going to make the alliance work better. If anything, the other way. And that's a mistake for the United States, even though it may be good for Mr. Trump and the Republicans, like a lot of things that are happening these days.
Richard, in our last 2 minutes, I want to touch on one last point. The tariffs are not going to help the U.S. working class. Manufacturing and high-paying jobs are not coming back to the United States. That's not going to happen. But it could happen. There's nothing about manufacturing or having manufacturing in the United States that would make it impossible for workers to have decent paying jobs. Right. The only thing that makes it impossible is that these capitalist corporations are producing for their profit, not for our need, not for society's needs, certainly not for the workers. So, what American workers need, what the U.S. workers need is not tariffs, but actual revolution. I mean, they actually need a change in a system so that manufacturing and all that which is needed can be produced closer to home. That makes a lot more sense from the point of view of the environment. It only went overseas so that capitalists could make super profits, but there's no reason manufacturing can't come back. It's not about really high wages per se. It's about capitalism that looks at high wages in a way that says, oh no, we can't pay the workers decent wages because that'll cut into our profit margin. So I just wanted to say this in our last 2 minutes because I know right now in the steel workers union, in the auto workers union, huge debates going on about tariffs. Tariffs are not the solution. Anyway, we have about 90 seconds left. Go ahead.
Very quickly. A tariff is like a sales tax, everybody. It's regressive. It makes no adjustment for your ability to pay the way the income tax does. The same 10% tariff on something is like a 10% sales tax. Rockefeller pays the same money you do to buy that object with the 10% on it. The income tax says you pay a higher percentage as you have more of the capacity to pay. So don't look, it is a horrible way for any problem to be solved, number one. Number two, the glorification of manufacturing. I won't repeat what you say, which is right, but another. Manufacturing jobs were not lovely. They were stinking, rotten, awful jobs that people got hurt in. Don't be so quick to think that that's what you want. The argument about the environment, absolutely right. Balanced economies are better than unbalanced one. The very word gives it away. But yes, just like the profit motive made the jobs go to Europe, the profit motive made the United States be less and less of a manufacturer and more of a service industry. My profession loves to talk about the change from manufacturing to service as some kind of natural phenomenon. No, it isn't. It has got an awful lot to do with the fact that manufacturing is where we started. That's where the unions grew and became strong enough to get a piece of the action so that the profits went, guess where? To services where? Guess what? Unions were weak. Unions had a hard time. This is the core of our problem. If we don't deal with this fundamental profit-driven system, we'll be forever reforming because we haven't solved our problem, because we're not willing to go to the roots of it, which have to do with the system we live under. Hopefully, we are being taught by Mr. Trump finally to get to that issue, which Democrats and Republicans have worked so hard to prevent us from seeing.